Yeah, so this has been a long time coming. It's been what, 3.5 years? Wow, time sure does fly. Anyway, to get you up to speed, I started ranking all 30 games from Rare Replay. You know, that collection of classic Rare games on Xbox One, released back in 2015. I wanted to split it up into 3 parts, and so far only did part 1, covering games 30 through 21. So if you haven't watched that old video yet, or just wanted a refresher, because let's face it, that was a long time ago, go watch it, as there'll be a link in the description below. So what's taken me so long to do this, I hear you cry? Well, sorry to disappoint, I don't actually have an excuse. I just ended up doing other videos I fancied making, and before I knew it, we were in 2019. I suppose seeing the recent updates of Rare's latest game, Sea of Thieves, got me back into the mood to play their old games again. Now remember, this is a ranking video, so if you thought I ranked a game too high or too low, at the end of the day, it's my opinion, and my opinion alone. We cool? Cool. Obviously, this being part 2, I'll be covering the ranked games of 20 through 11. So let's not waste any more time, sorry it's been so long, and let's just go straight into my number 20. Enjoy. Released in 2005, Perfect Dark Zero had a somewhat rocky 5-year development cycle. Set as a prequel to the N64 original, it began its life on the GameCube, before moving over to the Xbox after the Microsoft buyout in 2002, and then finally as an Xbox 360 launch title. As a result, it looks like a 6th generation game, but with a 7th generation glossy sheen, which I'm gonna be frank, has aged really poorly. The art itself was done by magazine design veteran Will Overton, which I actually really like, especially the concept art, as PDZ originally had an anime-inspired look to it, but then that slowly morphed over time into a slightly more realistic aesthetic, and it really clashes with itself. This changing of ideas is unfortunately reflected in the game's design too, as it wants to be mission based like Rare's previous first person shooters, as well as using health bars and body armor, but tries to use a more linear level design like games of the mid 2000s. As a result, you can often get lost on exactly what it is the game wants you to do and where to go, so the devs place these garish green arrows on the floor that try to point you in the right direction. They work most of the time, but are a stark reminder of how poorly designed these levels actually are. Zero also incorporates a cover system, but because this came out a year before Gears of War perfected that mechanic, here it's just clunky and not all that fun to use. Often you'll find yourself not being able to smoothly swap sides, or worse, still be able to be hit by the enemy without you being able to reply. Another annoyance is that reloading your gun is mapped to the X button, like most games, but it's also the same button you use to pick up enemies' weapons off the floor. Other games have you hold said button a second or two to pick up the weapon, but in Zero it's a simple tap, so you'll find yourself unintentionally equipping the wrong gun in a hectic firefight. And hectic firefights are the bane of this game's existence, as Zero suffers from near unplayable slowdown, especially if there's a ton of explosions. Even the movement in general feels so slow, like you're wading underwater. Again, this is a game that is clearly straddling 2 generations' ideals. I don't even want to pretend to know what development crunch is actually like, I hear it's hell, but it feels like Zero was severely rushed to be ported over to the 360 in time for its launch. The menu for a start is in a 4:3 aspect ratio, but worse are the numerous bugs and glitches. Luckily they're more hilarious than game breaking, but seeing enemy corpses ragdoll and bounce all over the map is not a rare occurrence. It's like they're puppets on strings or something, it's so bizarre. Zero would sadly be the last game in the Perfect Dark series to see the light of day. It was directed by Chris Tilston, who had previously been the lead designer on the Killer Instinct series and would go on to work at DICE, as recently as the design director on 2018's Battlefield 5, a game that I called my most disappointing game of that year. Rare have since tried to continue Perfect Dark with various concepts and pitches, but so far with no success. As far as Microsoft are concerned, they already have their better performing sci-fi shooters in Halo and the previously mentioned Gears of War. It's sad how this series went out, as a game with a major identity crisis plagued with numerous problems. Perfect Dark Zero can be mildly fun and unintentionally hilarious at times, but I'll forever remember it as the game that should have sold me on a launch 360, but just didn't. Originally released in the arcades in 1986 and the following year on the NES, Slalom is noteworthy in being the first game released under the company's then new name, Rare, as they'd previously been known as Ultimate Play the Game. Slalom is a simple game where you ski down one of 3 mountains, each with 8 courses of increasing difficulties, as you weave in and out of flagpoles, avoiding trees, other skiers, and snowmen. Plenty of snowmen. For an NES game, the pseudo 3D effect runs very smooth and gives you a nice sense of speed, especially when you push up on the controls to increase said speed, but at the loss of control, so there's a little risk versus reward in getting down in the allotted time. Honestly, I think the game looks great for its time, and the music is pretty great too, with it being composed by the legendary David Wise. Slalom received mixed reviews upon release, some calling it repetitive but fun, which I completely agree with, but other outlets dislike the game on account of it being unrealistic, which is absurd. I mean, look how realistic those buttocks are. It's like he's wearing nothing at all. Released in 1989 for the NES, Cobra Triangle was programmed and designed by Mark Betteridge, who would later work on Battletoads, Killer Instinct and Conquer, with the music once again being composed by David Wise. Cobra Triangle is a simple arcade game on the surface, but has a lot of moving parts. You control a speedboat from an isometric angle as you progress upriver, shooting at other boats, avoiding land turrets and various mines. There's a lot of variety on here, as one level is a simple race upriver at high speeds, then you're transporting mines to a designated area, there's bonus stages that see you collect power-ups on the end of jumps, or protecting hapless villains from being taken away, as well as travelling against the flow of the river, avoiding many obstacles like logs and whirlpools. That last one sucks worse than the whirlpools themselves, but the rest of the missions are all a ton of fun, including the cool bosses, although they are incredibly challenging. I find them nigh on impossible without Rare Replay's rewind function. The levels are rarely dished out to the player in the same order, giving Cobra Triangle a great sense of replay value, which is definitely needed, seeing as how I kinda get bored of the game after about 15 minutes of play. I think my favourite aspect has to be the little propeller that sprouts out at the end of every mission and flies you to the next level. It's completely unnecessary, but just one of those little attention to details that Rare would become infamous for. First released on the N64 in November '96 in North America, and the following year in PAL territories, Killer Instinct Gold is essentially a port of Killer Instinct 2 from the arcades. It also marks the first release from Rare on the N64, the very system that would define the company's status as one of the greats of that generation. But Killer Instinct Gold is definitely not their finest. Gold had all the series veterans returning, including Kevin Bayliss as designer and Robin Beanland as composer. In fact, the game's soundtrack was released on CD, a rarity for the time. For people unaware, Killer Instinct is a 6-button one-on-one fighting game that plays somewhat similar to the Mortal Kombat series, albeit a lot more focused on combos. I mean, the series' Ultra Combo soundbite is up there with Mortal Kombat's own Finish Him or Halo's Killing Spree as the best announcers in gaming period. I'll be honest though, I'm not a fighting game guy, so I'm usually terrible at anything that isn't Soul Calibur or Smash Brothers. However, KI is a simple enough game to pick up, but I find it incredibly challenging to master. Luckily, there is a fairly robust training mode as well as a practice mode where you can hone your skills, along with your usual arcade and tournament modes. Personally, my favourite character to play as is Kim, mainly because I like to play as the fast, agile characters. But looking at her now, she actually reminds me a little bit of Horizon Zero Dawn's Aloy, just like 20 years before. Visually, it hasn't aged too well, what with the fighters being 2D sprites on a 3D backdrop, which wasn't uncommon in the early 3D era, even Nintendo did it with Mario Kart 64. But when you consider that this was one of the games that was supposed to show off the power of the N64, or as the Ultra 64 as it was known back then, it already looked dated when compared to other fighting games of that time, what with Virtua Fighter 2 and Tekken 2 already out. The thing is, playing Killer Instinct Gold on an Xbox One is nothing but a novelty to me these days, what with the, in my opinion, superior arcade original of KI2 being available on Xbox's store, as well as the brilliant 2013 reboot and all of its DLC. Gold is still a fun fighter, but at the end of the day, there are better options on both the N64 and Xbox. Originally released on the NES in the summer of '91, the very first Battletoads was designed by the Stampers and Greg Mayles, with art by Kevin Bayliss and music composed by, of course, David Wise. It's a fairly standard beat-em-up of its time, but really pushes the NES to its limits, what with it being a late release in the console's lifecycle. The animations are fluid, the combat has a satisfying crunch to it, and there's a fair amount of variety in the gameplay. So you can be beaten up on goons 1 minute, then next you're abseiling down a shaft, and then you're riding the infamous hoverbikes, which, yeah, kinda suck. But the game's draw is definitely in its brilliant animations during combat. I'll never tire of seeing the Toad's limbs grow to emphasise whacking the enemies. I especially love how you fight the first boss from their perspective as you throw rocks at the screen. It's all relatively easy to start with, but of course Battletoads has a reputation for being hard and there's good reason for it. From there I feel the game starts to become more frustrating than it's worth. I'm all for a good challenge, but anything past the first couple of levels is just absurd, even in co-op with a friend. In fact, it's actually probably harder with a friend, simply being because there's friendly fire, and you will hit each other no matter how hard you try not to. So yeah, Battletoads is a fun and good looking NES classic, but only for about 15 minutes. Oh, and the pull screen music is an absolute banger, how could I nearly forget? I already spoke about the first RC Pro-Am in the previous Rare Replay video, and its sequel is pretty much more of the same, but with an emphasis on more. Released in late 1992 on the NES with music composed once again by David Wise, RC Pro-Am 2 improves on the one thing I had a problem with in the first one, a lack of multiplayer. In fact, Pro-Am 2 even supports 4 players simultaneously, and doesn't require some multi-tab accessory on the Xbox One like you would have needed to back in the day. I'll say this now though, getting 3 other friends together to play can be absolute carnage. This is mainly due to sharing the same screen, so if you fall behind you'll just be pulled along like you're on some kind of string. Skill pretty much stays behind the moment you leave the starting line, but in turn it makes Pro-Am 2 a brilliant party game, even over 25 years later. Having said that, there is still an element of strategy in the form of upgrades, as the higher you place in each race, the more money you accumulate to purchase upgrades. These range from increasing your speed or better turning, as well as purchasing weapons like rockets, bombs and buckshots, which can be used to steal money off other players. So you're not as reliant on picking up random power-ups on the track like the previous game. Admittedly, the menus themselves can be a little cumbersome to navigate, but as I've already said, Pro-Am 2 is basically the first one, but better in pretty much every way. If you love the original Battletoads but found the speeder bike section too punishing or just downright shit, then let me introduce you to the superior Battletoads arcade. Originally released in 1994 exclusively in arcades, well, until now. It was developed by pretty much the same team as the original, although weirdly it was published by EA of all companies. So yeah, arcade is pretty much just more Battletoads but looking a lot sharper. The best thing about it is that it supports up to 3-player co-op this time, compared to the NES's measly 2, which I always thought was weird. You create these 3 playable characters for a game but only have 2-player mode? But whatever, the arcade game rocks. It's like the first game but on steroids. You can tell that a little game called Mortal Kombat had come out in the time between the original and this one, as there's a ton of gore now, from whacking enemies with blunt objects to taking bosses' heads clean off and watching the red stuff spray all over the screen. Everything just has a lot more flair. Even the opening level is like something out of Star Wars, complete with knockoff Star Destroyers in the background. I'd say that the only downside is that, like many side-scrolling beat-em-ups, the gameplay can get a little stale before you get to the end. And you will get to the end this time, because you get unlimited continues with no penalty and there's no dumb speeder bike sections with awkward perspectives. Unfortunately, this was the last time we'd see the Battletoads in action for quite a while, because as fun as this game is, by 94 this genre was already dying. Most of the arcades was already moving into the 3D era by this point, what with games like Virtua Fighter already out. As a result, Battletoads arcade didn't do too well, so along with Rare's success in the first Donkey Kong Country, they began to slowly move back onto the console scene. But hey, 25 years later and we've got that new Battletoads game coming out, so here's hoping it's good. Let's rewind it all the way back to 1983 with the company's first ever release, Jetpac. Honestly, I'm shocked at how playable this game still is today, which you can't say a lot about many games that are nearly old enough to have a midlife crisis. Designed and programmed by the Stamper Brothers themselves, Jetpac was only available here in the UK until the unlockable port 16 years later in Donkey Kong 64. In case you can't already tell, Jetpac is an old school one-screen arcade game, where you control Jetman as you piece back together your ship, refuel it and avoid the many colourful enemies to then progress to the next screen. You can shoot back, but only being able to shoot vertically, it can be harder than it looks. The controls are nice and simple, only using the D-pad to move and one button to shoot, and that's pretty much it. For what it is, it's fun and fluid for its time, and definitely has that one more go feeling to it. Or you could just use the rewind feature to endlessly play it. Your choice, I won't judge. Released in 2007 on Xbox Live Arcade with art by Will Overton and music composed by Steve Burke, who previously worked on Star Fox Adventures and would go on to contribute music for the ukulele, Jetpac Refuelled is basically a remake of the Spectrum original. The core gameplay loop is largely untouched, as you still control Jetman, piecing together your ship, then refueling it and avoiding waves of enemies. Only this time there's actual power-ups, so you can now shoot vertically as well as horizontally, or even acquire a spread shotgun. There's also collectible nukes you can use to handily wipe the screen, and now the boosting is mapped to the triggers rather than awkwardly pushing up. My only gripe would be that the camera is too zoomed in, so it pans across the stage rather than seeing the whole thing. It's not game breaking, but there's something to be said about being able to see everything in the level, like the original. Speaking of which, the original is actually fully playable in the XBLA remake, and it's completely redundant here on the Rare Replay collection, especially as it doesn't allow you to cheat with the rewind ability. Playing Refuelled just makes me wish that Rare did more smaller projects like this on XBLA, especially with other classic games of theirs that could have done with a remake, like Attic Attack or Gunfight. Unfortunately, Rare would shift their focus to the Kinect not long after, so we never saw this happen. Who knows though, maybe one day. If there's one game on this collection that I've slowly warmed to over time, it's Grabbed by the Ghoulies, although its name I'll never get tired of saying. Released in 2003 as Rare's first Microsoft published game, it was largely developed by the same team who made Banjo-Tooie, with Greg Mayles as lead designer, Chris Sutherland as lead programmer, and Grant Kirkhope composing the music. The thing is, Ghoulies plays nothing like the Banjo games, as it's instead more of a beat-em-up brawler. If I had to compare it to anything else, I'd say it's like a 3D Battletoads crossed with like Luigi's Mansion's style and aesthetic. However, the combat isn't really deep at all, so you won't be juggling foes with crazy combos like something out of Devil May Cry. In fact, you don't even use the face buttons for attacks at all, as it's all contextually mapped to the right stick, which I'm not gonna lie, it takes a little while to get used to, especially when it means the triggers are used for the camera controls. So yeah, back in 2003, this is not what I wanted from Rare on the then newer hardware. Coming off of the likes of Banjo, Perfect Dark and Conquer, with former Rare devs going on to make the Time Splitters series, Grabbed by the Ghoulies felt incredibly underwhelming by comparison. But playing this game again in 2015 and now 2019, Ghoulies has held up tremendously well. Sure, I still think the game has its problems. The combat for one is far too simple and shallow to continue to be fun after a couple of hours of play, but the amount of charm injected into it is enough to rival some of Rare's best. The animations are wonderfully expressive, like something out of a Hanna-Barbera cartoon, which is fitting because that's exactly what Rare were inspired by whilst making the game. The characters are fun and unique, and there's plenty of Rare's trademark innuendos littered throughout. The visuals have held up so brilliantly as well, thanks largely to the fabulous art style, especially playing it now in HD with widescreen support on the Xbox One. You've only got to compare it to other games of its era to see how great Ghoulies still looks. On a personal level, pretty much every Halloween for the last decade I've played through Luigi's Mansion. It's the perfect Halloween game in my opinion, as it's short and evokes the light-hearted cartoony spookies that I enjoy of that time of year. However, last year I played through Grabbed by the Ghoulies instead, and you know what? I think I'm going to do that again this year, which I never thought I'd say 16 years ago. Who knows, in a few more years time this could crack my top 10. As for now, I'm going to leave it where it is. And with that, I'm done. Again, just want to say sorry to those that have waited nearly 4 years for this video. I can assure you it will not take another 4 to get the last part out, because yeah, the next part will be the top 10. So until then, let me know what you think of this video and my placements, as well as your predictions for the order of what the last 10 games will be. I want a huge shout out and thank you to Alex, who has edited this entire video you've just watched, just in case you're wondering why it seemed more professional. Anyway, until next time, thank you for watching and take care.